Graduate of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, and the School for Social Research in New York City. He also taught in Social Sciences Department at Hostos Community College of the City University of New York. He pursued further studies in general theoretical psychology at Fordham University of New York City. He has authored a series of articles and books, one being an exceptionally well-written book, The Developmental Psychology of a Black Child. He has also taught a dynamic 5-week course on self-hatred. He is currently the co-owner of the Harlem Graphics near the Apollo Theater, located in New York. On my personal consideration, I like to say that he shines like Rod Daly, since he speaks the truth and expels falsehood through his wisdom. He has given us strength to continue our struggle in this foreign land, which our ancestors were forced to come to. May the radiant light that he is blessed with never diminish. May his righteousness endure. May his righteousness be for eternity, for it endures. Its worth is real and will lead him to blessedness. What more can be said that he is part of a never-ending African tradition? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's good to see you here again today and to see your concern about the continuance and the survival of our people. I'm going to talk a bit about economics. Of course, I do not claim to be an economist, nor a person who's heavily versed in business. In fact, I think one of the major issues we have to confront in this, in our present set of circumstances, is that while we have done a good deal to rediscover our history and, of course, to highlight our history, and there's a good deal of information concerning our bodies, melanin, and so forth, I think we need to broaden the themes of the kind of education we are giving in the community. And one of the things we have to do is that, of course, is broaden our theme around economics. We need a person, as we have some very distinguished people in history and anthropology and education and other areas who've spoken to us on many occasions. I think in addition we need someone of stature, someone whom we respect, to speak to us continuously about economic development and economic realities. There is a major question as to our survival as a people into the 21st century. And as you can see, the title here, African American People Facing the 21st Century. Are we ready? It is a very, very pertinent question. While we have duly and rightfully emphasized our history, and we should continue to do so, we must also be futuristic in our orientation. Thank you. And plan for the future. Think not only in terms of the next few years, but in terms of the next 100 years or so. In about a month or two, we'll be talking about, of course, the greatness of our people, and we'll celebrate that greatness of our people. But we must remember, we must not forget that great peoples and their civilizations were and are based on great economic systems. Too often, I think when we discuss the greatness of our people, we put a great deal of emphasis on spirituality, as we should, and the emphasis there is certainly right in many ways. But But I think sometimes we forget that greatness is more than merely the gods we worship. You see, that, and I say somewhat facetiously, that I have yet to see a god build a temple. We talk about Egyptian temples and so forth, or build any building. Buildings are built by people. And buildings are not just built by a spiritual impulse alone. There has to be an economic, social system that's the basis and foundation for buildings to take place. So when we talk about the greatness of our people and our civilizations, we must remember those civilizations were also based on great economic systems. They were based on effective control over some vital resources. So when we talk about the empires of Ghana, Mali, and so forth, we see them having some control over salt or gold or some other resource that was needed and that was used by other people and traded with in terms of other people. And therefore, you'll see the civilizations built around the control or influence on vital resources. When you talk about the building of great cities and so forth, we have to recognize that great cities and great philosophical systems and great religious systems and so forth come into being when agriculture has now become controlled by people, when there's enough surplus food produced for people to have time to engage in philosophical discourse and thought and writing and development of art and skills and other kinds of things. When there's enough agricultural surplus so that vast armies of people who build pyramids and build great temples and build cities can be fed, so that the people who supervise them are paid and fed. The people who build these great civilizations and administer these great civilizations must ultimately be fed from the surpluses produced by these civilizations. If we're going to talk then about the future greatness of black people and of African people, then we cannot talk about that without talking about the building of an economic substructure. It is not going to be built merely by worshiping ancestors. It's not going to be built merely by recognizing our past greatness, or merely by just knowing ourselves. All of those things are key ingredients. Don't get me wrong. However, we also have to recognize that we've got to get down to the nuts and bolts of an economic system. So then, the great civilizations of our peoples were built on great economic systems, effective control over some vital resources, and some conducive social political organization. And I'll talk in a minute about the fact that an economy is not just the presence of money. That the ultimate foundation of an economy is the nature of the relationship between people. In fact, you can have an economy without money. The economies were present and were enormously influential before money in the form that we use it came into being. So we must recognize ultimately that an economic system is a system of human relations. And so when we talk about our great civilizations, we must see that you are talking about civilizations that had systems, had social and political systems, and systems of human relations that made their greatness apparent. So these systems must contain then compatible social political organizations and self-esteem, self-confidence, self-love, self-acceptance, courage, vision, daring, and leadership. The having of an economy, of course, it enhances the quality of life for people, enhances our possibilities for survival. Not just, the economy just does not just keep us alive, but actually makes it possible for our dreams to come true and to create the kind of world we would like to create. You hear a lot of talk about AIDS, for instance. And unfortunately, I think a great deal of the talk does not touch on how that is related to economics. We talk about the people who, through some conspiracy, created AIDS in the laboratory, and who perhaps have unleashed AIDS upon the African community. And we may talk about the nature of AIDS and talk about safe sex and so forth, and all of those things are important. But we must recognize that there is an economic component related to AIDS. That if AIDS is a form of germ warfare, then it signals to us the future. That our people may perish not so much in terms of laser beams coming from 400 or 500 miles out in space, or various exotic weapons that the result of Star Wars and our inability to fight wars in space to defend our interest. But that future warfare may be silent, and it may be relatively slow, and may be in the form of diseases like AIDS or other types that are unleashed and slowly and over periods of years, or maybe within a very short period of time, destroy the people without a shot being fired. Of course, when we look at the history of the Indian in the Western Hemisphere, we see that history of where thousands and thousands of people were destroyed through the use of germs. This means then that warfare in the future may not be carried out through the use of artillery and jet planes and so forth, but will be carried out through the use of intellect and research. We cannot fight AIDS by firing guns and weapons. We cannot fight AIDS by jet planes and laser beams in space. We have to fight AIDS through medical research. We have to fight AIDS through the organization of a medical delivery system. That means then we have to develop the intellectual power. We have to develop the institutional power to struggle against a germ warfare attack. That means a group of professors and researchers and others fighting a war in their laboratories, so that when a disease is released upon their population, they must then use their scientific knowledge and resources and institutions to develop a preventative against that disease. Not only must they develop the preventative, they must then have a system in place by which the preventative is distributed. It's not enough that you have a cure for disease. You must also have an economic, social, and political system that sees to it that the cure is distributed among the population. Right now, what is not even a cure for the disease of AIDS, AZT, will cost you over $10,000 a year to administer. So the mere discovery of a preventative for AIDS still does not mean that that preventative will be adequately distributed among the population. And therefore you need an economic system and a distribution system so that if a preventative is discovered, it can be adequately distributed among the population and across classes. It means then, in this instance, that blacks, we as African people, need our own world-class universities. The white universities are not going to function for us. Merely having knowledge is not going to function for us. Now, tomorrow afternoon I'll be talking to at the African Portrait Theater. We'll talk about education a bit, because I want to sort of attack this concept where we tend to think, I believe, that the mere accumulation of knowledge is going to be enough to bring about the salvation of our people. And knowledge is not enough. Just as I said earlier, money is not enough. Money is not an economic system. Knowledge is not a salvation system if the knowledge is not systematized and coordinated and used and distributed according to some plan and organized in a systematic fashion. So to educate a bunch of black boys and African boys and girls in terms of scientific knowledge, and yet not have scientific laboratories, you see, and not have universities available so that they can use their brains to save the people, means that we will die with knowledge in our heads. We have a great fund of knowledge as African Americans right now. And we have a greater fund of knowledge as African Americans than many nations have right at this point. But the knowledge is not organized in a way and in our interest. For us to fight a disease then like AIDS, it would not only be enough that we have people who know medicine and who know how to do medical research, we have to supply them with the medical institutes and with the resources. But to supply them with the institutes and resources, we have to have an economic system that pays for those institutes and resources. It's not enough that them just to learn mathematics and science. We have to have a place for our youngsters to work and have that work be productive for us as a people. So when we talk about economics, we're not just talking about ways people can earn more money and have better housing and move from one social position to another. And we're not just talking about increasing people's consumption and so forth as is normally projected. We are talking about the pure, raw reality of biological survival. The ability to live and continue to live and continue to keep our gene pool alive. So economics is not merely about the exotic beauty of owning something, but it's about staying alive. And the African economic situation is such that there are questions being asked about our ability to survive as African people. And this is centered around the economic system. Economics is about life itself. I read something here, no doubt some of you saw it the other day. Life expectancy for blacks dropped 2 years in a row. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we are dying, and we're beginning to die at a younger age. And this has to do with economics and other things. Let me just indulge me for a minute. Let me read some of these quotes here because I think it's a very important thing. For the first time in this century, the life expectancy of blacks in the United States has declined in 2 successive years, while that for whites has continued to increase, according to a report from the National Center for Health Statistics. Blacks who are naturally endowed to live longer than whites, by the way. You talk about this melanin. One of the advantages of melanin is the lengthening of life. And it's been very clear. When blacks live beyond the so-called average age of blacks, they live longer than whites. So if we lived healthily and lived in the manner that we should, we would naturally live longer than whites. So you have an unnatural situation going on here. Now, instead of this lifespan increasing, it's beginning to regress. This is serious, the researchers say. If you're looking for the big factors, they are homicides and accidents. But those things, of course, are tied into economics. Recently, there has been a tremendous increase in homicides among both young whites and blacks, but it has hit blacks harder, with a 15% increase in homicides among blacks for 1985 and 1986, compared with a 5% increase among whites. When we talk about self-hatred, we talk about hatred. Hatred is just not an attitude or a feeling. It is a behavioral orientation. Hatred expresses itself through destruction. And of course, that's the signature of hatred. When you see destruction and diminishment and deterioration taking place in human relations and in human life, you can be certain that hatred is existent and operating, even when it parades as love, which it often does. If we say that hatred is counterproductive and against life and is destructive, which it is, and love, of course, enhances life and is about development and growth, then hatred expresses itself in the world through destroying the world, through through destroying its environment. Then think a minute. If hatred does that in terms of its environment and in terms of the world, what then must self-hatred do? Hatred does not stop its work simply because it is contained within the personality. It continues. If hatred strikes outside, because that is its nature, then when it is lodged within the personality, it still strikes its host. In other words, then, an individual who is caught up in self-hatred is also caught up in self-destruction. They are simultaneously the same thing. And if you internalize racism, as too many of us have, and we internalize racism from a people who hate, then we come to hate ourselves, then we come to do the work of those people. We actually commit suicide and death in service of whites. If whites wish for us to die and do not wish to kill us directly as they do, we will also help them by engaging in self-hatred activities. And this is what self-hatred is. In other words, we literally make ourselves sick because they want us to be sick. When we take in their attitudes do the work inside of our bodies and inside of our minds. And so when we talk about homicides and murders and so forth, you see then a people who are busy killing themselves in service of the status quo. I often have said in my classes that the reason why black men kill each other so much is because we have not yet decided to kill white men. And that's ultimately what it's about. We have not yet decided to undertake the challenge to overthrow white power.
Right. Yeah.
When you talk about racism, and we often talk about racism without talking about the people who perpetrate it, and going to the ultimate logical conclusion, which is the annihilation of the people who perpetrated, or at least the neutralization of the people who perpetrated. Of course, we don't want to talk about that too much because it involves the concept of war and actual confrontation. But frankly speaking, you can't seriously talk about getting economic control of yourself unless you're ready to go to war with whites. You may as well face that reality. Maybe that's the reason why we've stayed away from economics for so long. But if we don't then deal with economics, then we have to deal with our own self-destruction. If we don't decide to kill the white man by various other ways, we are going to kill ourselves. This is a part of what we call loving the aggressor in a way that's self-destructive. Where the individual, because he is afraid to attack his source of frustration, attacks himself or attacks an innocent target. We then must recognize that we are destroying our lives because we haven't decided this. George Scott, when he was playing the part of Patton, said, it's not so much, in essence, that we are going to die for our country. We are going to make what? The other ones die for it. Okay? So it's not so much we're going to kill ourselves and we're willing to throw our lives on the line. No, make the other ones who are causing the problems pay for it with their lives instead of ours. Auto accidents also hit the two populations differently in those years, with an 8% rise in deaths among blacks and a 4% rise among whites. Deaths from AIDS as well as some other diseases such as pneumonia and tuberculosis. And notice tuberculosis is what has been called a disease of poverty. It's very much related and correlated with poverty. And here is the thing that we thought we'd gotten rid of 30, 40 years ago, and we're starting talking about it now. Of course, that's because we're again, of course, experiencing poverty going back into it. Also have increased disproportionately among blacks in recent years. So here we are dealing with tuberculosis again, which implies, of course, then economic deterioration increasing to such a degree that it is being reflected in disease and our people becoming diseased. Some officials attributed part of the problem to economic policies of the Reagan administration. We're right back at it again, you see. A part of our miseducation in these universities and colleges is the segmentation of knowledge and this business of specialization that we are caught up into. And I've tried to admonish black scholars again and again about this narrow kind of education and about accepting white definitions of who and what they are professionally. And recognizing that we as black scholars have to of necessity be more broadly educated and have a much broader vision than white scholars. We cannot let white scholars and professionals define our roles. The roles we are to play as black people and as professionals or whatever we are must be defined within the context of our lives as people and of our reality. I've spoken to someone about, I've seen some black teachers define themselves as 9th grade teachers, 7th grade teachers. You know, not teachers of people, they're just teaching the 7th grade. In other words, teaching an abstraction. And because their students who enter their rooms are not at the 9th grade level or the 7th grade level, they feel insulted. You know, I didn't come here to teach kindergarten, I'm a 9th grade teacher, but you don't have anything. Why is that 9th grade? You have people. You have students who need to be taught. You redefine who you are and what you're about and get on with the business of teaching. But too many who've accepted the definition given them by their white colleagues, you see, become frustrated, angry, hostile, and resentful, and create and maintain the problem that they're complaining about. And so when and I'm saying this because you can study diseases in a medicinal sense and deal with it in terms of medicines and herbs and this and that. But you must recognize that diseases, like anything else in life, also have a political side. And that diseases are produced by political, economic, social factors. Diseases that flow from radiation, that flow from pollution, that flow from being located in the worst parts of town, that flow from poor medical practices and so forth, are diseases that flow from economic, political, and social realities. And often many of the diseases that have so-called been conquered in the history of mankind have not been conquered in terms of drugs and medicine, but have been conquered in terms of political and social reorganization, have been conquered in terms of sanitation practices, not vaccines. When London was a pigsty, just a cesspool of disease, where people were throwing their excrement and urine right out the window, right onto the streets, and so forth. Of course, you see, you don't see that on Channel 13 with people with all these nice gowns and stuff, right? All this has been forgotten. You don't recognize that those kings and queens used to crap right in there, right on the floors, in corners, and places like that. And these people hated baths and hated things like that. These things are not told. We're talking about things that really only disappeared maybe a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah, they leave that out of humanity.
Yeah, very much so. And it's not dealt with, and the history is solid. And these diseases and plagues were produced by political, social organizations. At last then, when swamps were cleared and sewers were built and streets and things were reorganized, disease was then reduced. Which indicated then it was not the medicines, but the political, social, economic organizations that had impact on diseases and helped to remove diseases and plagues. And this is the thing we have to recognize. This is one of the reasons why the medical system in this country and other nations will work against the interests of black people because they're too narrow. And their lives, of course, depends upon the presence of disease and, in a sense, the maintenance of disease, which is one of the reasons why often people who are educated in medicine are not educated in politics. And I tell black professionals again and again Teaching does not occur merely in the classroom. Social work does not occur merely at the social work institution or at your particular job location. If you are not involved in political change as a black professional or black worker, you are not fully doing your job. Because it's the politics and the political structure that is often the cause of problems that on the face of it appear to be quite different from social problems and issues. Where you live and how you live will determine to a good degree the incidence of disease. And where you live and how you live, of course, will to a good extent depend upon your economic system and the political system.
Right.
And here then you see in this article, despite the first opening of it, you find the life expectancy shortening, the increase in suicides, increase in homicide, and yet, right at the bottom here it says what? Some officials attributed part of the problem to what? To economic policies of the Reagan administration, which they said have increased homelessness, which is a case for disease and destruction. Cut aid and health care to the poor. As I told you earlier, it's not enough just to have medicines to cure diseases. You must have the appropriate social, political, and other vehicles that deliver those things that fight diseases. And when you then cut Medicaid, Medicare, you cut medical facilities and so forth, you are giving people death sentences.
That's right.
And the medicines are there, but the medicines are not being made available to the people for one reason or other. Either they are not affordable, or either these systems and institutions are not there to deliver them. And otherwise hurt blacks proportionately. It is the first time since 1962 that the life expectancy for any race has declined 2 years in a row, and the only time in this century that the life expectancy for blacks dropped while the figures for whites rose. So what do we have going on here, ladies and gentlemen? This researcher stated that while the increase in life expectancy among blacks are generally more precarious, because there are many causes of death that are not being overcome as rapidly for blacks as for whites. Thus, it is easier for adverse changes to reverse a slight upward trend. It first states tuberculosis, which is thought to be rising because of damage to immune systems caused by acquired immune deficiency syndrome, increased among blacks by 8.5%, while it dropped among whites by 3% in 1985 and 86. So we see tuberculosis on the increase, some 8.5% among our people, and having to do to damage to the immune system. Because we know that the AIDS virus, in a sense, the damage caused by the AIDS virus is not so much its own by the very nature of that virus, but it's what it does to the system. In that it destroys the system and it damages the immune system to such a degree that minor diseases, which would normally be overcome, now overcome the system. When you're talking about then people who are malnutritioned or people who are under what we call even psychological stress, one of the hallmarks of psychological stress is a reduction in the immune system's capacity to fight disease. People who are under stress, mental and psychological, are people who are more open to being struck by diseases. And when we look then at our black lives and at our African lives in this nation and around the world, we see a people who are under a tremendous amount of stress, and therefore people who become vulnerable to suffering and death. Deaths due to cancer were also greater among blacks and may have contributed to the gap. Infant mortality among blacks is more than double that among whites and accounts for a large part of the difference in life expectancy. Those differences between the death of black children and the death of black babies have not decreased over the past years when we talk about black people in comparison to whites. The infancy mortality rate is quite high and has not shown a decline. But that gap has not changed in the past few years and could not explain the gap that widened in 1985 and 86. And there are other things mentioned here, but the experts said it is difficult to link the social the social policy and life expectancy, but history has recorded some clear cases. For example, there was a large drop in the number of suicides among old people when the Social Security system was established. So again, you see a connection between political social systems and life itself, and between economic systems and life itself. It, of course, goes on further to talk about the disparity in black and white mortality, and the expert who said that the rise in homicides was likely a major factor. He said that 1 in 20 black men may expect to die from homicide, But the homicide increase alone cannot account for all of the difference. Of course not. It's a part of it. I saw an interesting piece here as I was reading Bullock's history of black education in the South, to show how things sort of come around again and again. And I'll just have to start this quotation in the middle in the interest of time. Sparrow and Harris estimated that there were over 100,000 black artisans in the South at the close of the Civil War. By 1890, however, the skilled Negro had been virtually eliminated as a worker. And we often forget, we think that we are just entering into an age where we're gaining skills, and we have to recognize that we lost skills. And that we had so many people who were skilled at the end of the so-called slavery period. And that there were deliberate efforts by our enemies to reduce our skills and capacity as people. Over the passage of time, the forces of economic and social discrimination, and get the word economic and social discrimination, exposed Negroes to forms of personal and communal instability that were beyond the capacity of Negro education to correct. Again, indicating that education is not enough. It is a part of it, but not enough. Knowledge is not enough. A very important part of our development, but not sufficient in and of itself. The growing instability of their family life robbed the Negro child of his father model and exposed him to a growing matriarchy, which even now threatens his manhood. Crime rates soared among them, and the self-hate that segregation generated helped give them the highest incident of homicide of any element of the American population. Making the Negro image even more unsightly was the insecurity of body and person that the segregated tradition encouraged, and that the special education program was unable to correct. He's talking about special education. He's in the context that he's using this term special education. He's talking about it in the sense of the founding of black agricultural colleges, vocational colleges, and institutes and technical colleges, the education of black scientific farmers who ran into the problem that after they learned their agriculture very well and learned to farm scientifically, they had the problem, of course, of getting a farm to farm on, or they had the problem of the fact that the white plantation owners and so forth had no place for highly educated black farmers. If they needed anyone, they needed sharecroppers and ignorant ones who knew how to count very well, so they wouldn't be able to tell when and how they were being cheated. And so often then special education, in the sense of especially preparing black males and females how to farm scientifically and do other things scientifically, did not necessarily solve the problem. Out of the persistent blockages to the economic mobility of Negroes came increased poverty and pauperism. The problem of dependency was particularly serious among those in the urban South. He goes on to say, as a result of these economic and social practices, diseases among the Negroes, placing a severe pressure upon their small crops of physicians and the limited health facilities available to the race. That is, the diseases spread among Negroes, placing a severe pressure on their small crops of physicians and the limited health facilities available to the race. During the period of slavery, when Negroes represented so much capital investment, again, now look at this thing here, of where, from white terms, human beings are seen as capital investment. and are seen in economic terms. Now, we're talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, and yet today, September 19th, 1988, we're still talking about what? Human capital. Human beings seen as capital investments. Now, note this sentence again then. During the period of slavery, when Negroes represented so much capital investment, not even me, their mortality rate was virtually the same as that of whites. Does the decrease then in life expectancy among our people mean that whites are beginning not to see us as valuable what? Capital investments? Does it also mean that we as a people also do not see ourselves as valuable capital investments as well? And therefore our enemy who had to keep us alive because it kept him alive may no longer need us that much to keep himself alive, and we who have not awakened into the necessity of creating an economic system are also not keeping our own selves alive. Is this what this decreased capacity is about? Again, showing a connectedness between economics and life itself, not just eating better or living in a bigger house and so forth. We're talking about the pure survival of the people. So what are we saying here? At one time we had a life but equal to that of whites. And yet things have changed. In fact, the Negro rate, here they, in terms of lifespan and so forth, was significantly lower than that of the white in some instances. That is, this was certainly true for those who lived. We're talking about the mortality rate here. So the word lower is referred to the mortality rate. In fact, the Negro rate was significantly lower than the white in some instances. So in many instances then, we were actually outliving these people. By 1910, however, the health picture had completely changed, and Negroes had begun to die at a rate almost double that of the whites. The most heavy loss was from the death of Negro babies, who died at the rate of 261 per 1,000 live birth, as compared to 129.7 for whites. And it goes on to talk about tuberculosis and other things then that occurred at this point in our history, and we see it visiting us again. So again then, we cannot emphasize enough that when we talk about economics, we're talking about life. Not just our ability to buy more gold chains and better cars and so forth and so on, but our ability to survive as a whole. In the interest of time, then, I'll just quickly go through a number of things. When we talk about the 21st century, we have to look at the trends of that century. And what are some of the trends? Well, one of the trends is one that was extolled in one of our major magazines, Newsweek, during the period February 22nd, 1988. And you see it, of course, titled what? The Pacific Century. Is America in decline? Reminds me of the statistic that was once developed by someone that showed a correlation between the hanging of black people and the price of cotton.
That's right.
As the price of cotton went down, the number of blacks hung went up. I've told people again and again that integrationism and all these dreams of Dr. Martin Luther King depends upon a healthy economy. Not morality, not teaching white folk to be good folk and all that other kind of stuff, but on whether there is enough of the economic pie to be shared. That the continued existence of our people does not depend upon civil rights laws being put upon books, does not depend upon whether we're going to have the right people in the Supreme Court or not, does not depend upon who is the president and so forth, doesn't depend upon that at all. It depends to a good extent upon the availability of resources. It does not matter what kind of laws you have on the books and so forth. If there's ever a point of time when the white man has to choose between feeding his child and your own, he's going to feed his own first.
That's right.
Since he is the one that passes the laws and enforces the law. If it becomes a life and death situation, he is not going to enforce a law that is going to work against the interests of his children and the life of his people. And for us to sit around and think that civil rights laws and human rights organizations are going to save us is ridiculous, and we should be ashamed of ourselves at this day and time to be thinking in those terms. Nothing but pure power and the pure ability to resist the incursion of our enemies is going to save us ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, not laws passed by these other people. Now we see we are coming into a new age here. And I've often asked this question: assuming that we will gain liberation from the European, are we going to only gain that liberation at the price of falling under the authority of the Asian? Do not assume simply because the Asian is somewhat non-white that we're going to be so-called better off. There are a lot of people who identify with other non-whites, and think, well, they're getting the best of the white man, rah, rah, rah. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in better for you. Who told you that the Japanese would treat you any better than the white man just treated you? Or the Korean, or any of the other groups? Particularly when there's a struggle for scarce resources, ladies and gentlemen. And I think you know in your hearts that you're not going to get any better treatment from one group or another if there is not enough to go around. Is America in decline? This is the kind of future that we are facing. The idea here, of course, is if America goes into decline, we are going to catch hell in this society. We may as well face it. And one of the things, and we can see then, these groups are not only operating in the world, on the global scale, but are operating in our very communities, and have made incursions into the very infrastructure of our community, and now set and ready to exploit whatever economic resources we have available to us in the community period. Let's do some quick quotations then from this particular piece. Not long ago, the idea that the world could look like this in the next century seemed unthinkable. And these are the other people talking here. Americans, protected for 2 centuries by vast oceans, enriched by natural resources, and a risk-taking spirit, have never taken easily to changes beyond their control. That's rough business, you see. People have never had to deal with the fact now that things are beyond their control, and this creates a lot of problems. You know what happens to individuals when they begin to feel that the world has gotten out from under their control? You can imagine then what will happen to people who begin to feel that the world is getting outside of its control. And often what happens when people feel that the world is getting outside of their control, they look around for scapegoats. They look around for someone to attack. And they don't have to look far, because what the victims they usually choose are the people who are politically, economically, and otherwise the weakest. And we know who those people are.
That's right.
Vietnam drove home the bitter lesson that the United States was no longer a hegemonic power, and the oil shock of the 1970s showed its resources were not sufficient enough to insulate it from economic calamity. So here again, a reality is being faced. Now Japan is arguably the world's most powerful economic actor, ready to assume leadership in an era of rising Asian power, a period that experts have already dubbed the Pacific Century. In fact, the Asians call it the Asian Century, and they talk about it consciously. They had a meeting not too many months ago where the phrase, the Asian Century, was a conscious phrase and used in a very conscious way. If things continue as they are now, what are the people who study this trend said, it won't be much beyond 2010. So we're talking about within our lifespan there, before Japan becomes the leading power in world politics. Reinforcing the Asian Pacific's rising economic influence are the so-called Four Tigers, the newly industrialized countries of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And staring ever more energetically after decades of economic idleness is China, a once and perhaps future superpower. With Asia coming on so strong, says William Overholt, a Bankers Trust economist in Hong Kong. The United States in the next 100 years could become a giant Australia. So here again we see a people reassessing their position in the world. And we're going to see then that position of the United States is going to reflect back upon us as African Americans in a negative sort of way. It means that we as African people have to get over this idea that has been inculcated in us through too much literature and through going to the movies such as the good, the bad, and the ugly, fistful of dollars, where the white man always wins. And many of us believe, as long as we are attached to the American white man, because we see him winning no matter what. Even when he lost the war in Vietnam, we see him making movies where he still wins in some way or another. And we figured then that as long as we are hooked up to him, he's going to always win, because for many of us, we just can't believe the possibilities that the white man can lose, that there's another group of people who can overrun this man. And so we think then that since his winning is inevitable, even if we suffer, we're going to get some of the crumb from the table of his winning. But here again is a man beginning to realize that he is losing the game. And if he is losing the game, then how much more so if we don't get control of ourselves as people, will we also lose the game as people? I was looking at a show, some of you might have seen this show the other evening about superconductors. I think it was Friday, I think yesterday or Thursday, they did a piece on TV, and how the United States is in a very precarious position in terms of superconductors, and how, of course, the superconductor industry is going to transform the use of energy, and how those nations who have an edge in terms of superconductors are going to have a great edge economically.
That's right.
And how Japan has already organized its assembly lines and industrial base and organized its governmental and business systems to take advantage of superconductors, and how the United States is still stumbling around and fumbling around. It is so unfortunate that we as black people think white folks do everything right. And I run into that all the time as a business person. I'm going to take it to the white man. And that's because so many of us don't read the Wall Street Journal, we don't read the New York Times business section.
That's right.
And where every day you see mistakes and stupid errors and everything made all the time by these people. But the average black people person just thinks, oh, they do everything right and they get it. You know what the situation is, ladies and gentlemen, they are able to make us pay for their mistakes. That's the advantage. I, as a black businessman or as a small business person, you make a mistake, you got to eat it, man. You're out. Con Ed, some of your electrical company over here, AT&T, they make a mistake, what do?
Up your rate.
Up your rate, that's all. And you think they're some great business person. All they do is just make you pay for it. You see, one way or the other. And yet, you can see the mismanagement of the American economy. The mismanagement of the American economy has been atrocious. The mismanagement of American business has been atrocious. But we, of course, as people, because we don't read deeply into economics and don't get deeply into the sources of economic news and so forth, are left with this illusion that whites know all about business, they know how to run it, and if you want it run right, go to the white man. And yet, when we look at the reality, we see that this is not the case. And we are going to suffer as a result thereof. You see, in semiconductors, the very vital part of computers and so forth, the United States is suffering terribly and is going to be overrun. The United States government has to subsidize the semiconductor industry, because if not, the Japanese, they would have to buy the semiconductors for the computers from the Japanese, which means the Japanese would know, in a sense, the structure of their most vital military computer operations. And in other words, if we buy all of our semiconductors from the Japanese, then in a sense our whole war machine is conducted through computers, and electronic warfare will be exposed to their knowledge and exposed to their sabotage. Again, we're talking about economics and the pure survival of the people. And on this piece will go. Of course, we don't have time to look at it all, but it's an interesting kind of piece. If you get this magazine, get copies of them. I think it would be enlightening. Let's just read one quick other thing here. Virtually all Americans will feel the dual impact of Asian immigration and investment. And this is the statement I find very interesting. Asian immigrants, who will number as many as 12 million by 2000, could affect America more profoundly than any group since the first boat people crossed over on the Mayflower. You get the impact of that? 12 million Asians in America will more profoundly affect America than the first boat people, of course referring to Europeans, who crossed over on the Mayflower. What about the 40 or 50 million African people in America? Are we saying then that 12 million Asians will have a greater impact on what goes on in America than the 40 or 50 million Africans? In fact, we're not even mentioned in this context at all. Then when we talk about spreading culture and so forth, we are not going to spread this African culture and have it impact upon this world until we have an economic impact upon this world. Culture is not just spread by ideas, it's spread along with trade. It's spread along with economic interactions between people. And you will find then culture and cultural imperialism being a part of economic imperialism. They are tied together. It's not simply because someone has some bright and great idea. Those ideas are reflective often of an economic order, support an economic order, and are disseminated through economic activities and so forth. Let's look again quickly at this future world, this world of the 21st century, human capital I showed you, of course. And on the cover it states here, the nation's ability to compete is threatened by inadequate investment in our most important resource, people. And of course, ultimately, is threatened by a lack of investment in what I think would be and could be the ultimate salvation of this country, and that is, of course, African people in America.
That's right.
The failure to invest in African Americans and in African period. Put simply, too many workers lack the skills to perform more demanding jobs. And as the economy comes to depend more and more on women and minorities, the New York City workforce is already majority black and Hispanic, non-white at this point. Here's a system that is going to depend upon minorities to continue itself. We face a massive job of education and training. In this sudden, we realize it's too late to say you neglect. This people thought that they could neglect the education and training of black people and continue to survive as a people. It can't be done. Now they're facing the problem. Can we educate these people rapidly enough and retrain them rapidly enough? Can we get over our racism and hatred enough that we can train these people to continue our lives and to save our nation and to save our way of life? And they are facing a major, major dilemma. Starting before, they talk about training, starting before kindergarten. Can we afford it? We have no choice. That's so right. We see America in a great crisis. But before you and before we as African people get too happy about their need for us, okay, there are things to be looked at. I don't have time to go through many of the quotes in here, and I'm going to skip them in the light of time. But there's one I'd like to make, because the popular article says, well, we're going to need these black people, but then the black people are so poorly educated, they have such a problem of literacy, and all of these other things we've laid on them, we're going to have a difficult time getting them ready to carry on the economy, even though we need them in a way. Let's see if there's some other ways of handling this. So here's one of the conclusions they reached. It's titled, the U.S. could lower the drawbridge again. Faced with labor shortages in earlier times, America opened its borders.
That's right.
So don't think because you're here and because this country now that the white man and the white male is becoming a decreasing member of the workforce, and white people are going to need more and more non-whites to work this country, that means we are automatically going to be sucked up into the system. There are other ways and other approaches. And what is mentioned here, immigration is still a policy option. the wild card in the labor market outlook. For Cornell University economist Vernon M. Briggs, unleashing even more immigration will stall the efforts to integrate women, blacks, and other minorities into the economy. And again here, we're looking at a situation. The immigration of other people into this nation is no accident.